Have you ever wondered how a handful of colonies could take on the most powerful empire in the world and win? It sounds like a movie plot, right? But this is the real story of the birth of the United States of America. Let's rewind to the 1770s. Picture 13 separate colonies strung along the east coast of North America. They were British subjects, living under the rule of King George III, thousands of miles away across the Atlantic Ocean. For a long time, things were okay. The colonies had their own governments, their own way of life. But then, things started to change. The British Empire had just finished a massive war, the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War. Wars are incredibly expensive, and Britain was deep in debt. The British government looked at the American colonies and thought, well, we protected you, so you should help pay for it. This led to a series of new laws and taxes. It started with things like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. Suddenly, colonists had to pay extra for everyday items like sugar, newspapers, and even playing cards. This wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle. The colonists had no representatives in the British Parliament. They had no voice in these decisions. This gave rise to a powerful slogan you've probably heard: no taxation without representation. Imagine your parents making rules for your life without ever asking for your opinion. That's how the colonists felt. They organized protests. They boycotted British goods. Women, who did most of the household shopping, became crucial players, refusing to buy British tea or cloth. Things got tense. In Boston, the tension boiled over. In 1770, a confrontation between colonists and British soldiers led to the Boston Massacre, where soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 people. This event was heavily publicized, with engravings by people like Paul Revere showing the British as ruthless aggressors. It was powerful propaganda that fueled anti-British sentiment across the colonies. Then came the Tea Act. To help the struggling British East India Company, Parliament gave it a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. This actually made tea cheaper, but it was another move to control colonial trade and cut out local merchants. The colonists were furious. In December 1773, a group of men, disguised as Native Americans, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This act of defiance became known as the Boston Tea Party. King George III and Parliament were not amused. They responded with a series of harsh laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. They closed Boston Harbor, shut down Massachusetts government, and forced colonists to house British soldiers in their homes. This was the final straw. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, these acts united the colonies. They realized they had to work together. So, in 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They weren't calling for independence just yet. They were trying to find a peaceful solution. They sent a petition to the king, listing their grievances and asking for their rights to be respected. The king ignored it. By 1775, the situation was a powder keg waiting for a spark. That spark came on April 19th. The British Army marched from Boston to Concord, Massachusetts, to seize a cache of colonial weapons. Paul Revere and other riders galloped through the night, warning the local militias, the Minutemen, who were ready to fight at a minute's notice. The first shots were fired on the village green in Lexington. No one knows for sure who fired first, but it was the shot heard round the world. The American Revolution had begun. The British continued to Concord, but on their march back to Boston, they were ambushed by thousands of colonial militia firing from behind trees, stone walls, and houses. It was a brutal introduction to a new kind of warfare. A month later, the Second Continental Congress convened. This time, the mood was different. War had started. They established the Continental Army and, in a crucial decision, appointed a Virginian named George Washington as its commander-in-chief. Washington wasn't the most experienced general, but he was respected, tall, and commanded authority. His leadership would become the glue that held the fragile army together. Even with the war underway, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. But a pamphlet called Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine, changed everything. It was written in simple, direct language that anyone could understand. Paine argued that it was absurd for a tiny island to rule a vast continent. He called for independence, not just as a political move, but as a moral imperative, a chance to create a new kind of nation founded on liberty. Common Sense was a runaway bestseller, and it swayed public opinion dramatically. The tide had turned. The Continental Congress decided it was time to make a formal break. They appointed a committee of 5, including John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and a young, eloquent Virginian named Thomas Jefferson, to write a declaration. Jefferson was the primary author. Drawing on the ideas of Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke, Jefferson penned one of the most famous documents in history, the Declaration of Independence. It laid out a simple, powerful philosophy. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It went on to list the grievances against King George III, a long train of abuses that justified their separation. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't just a letter to the king, it was a public announcement to the world. They were no longer fighting for their rights as British subjects. They were fighting for their existence as a new, independent nation, the United States of America. Signing that document was an act of incredible bravery. To the British, it was treason, and the penalty for treason was death by hanging. Benjamin Franklin famously quipped, "We must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately." Now, declaring independence was one thing, winning it was another. The odds were stacked against the Americans. They were facing the most powerful military in the world. The British Army was well-trained, well-equipped, and backed by the immense resources of an empire. The Continental Army, by contrast, was a ragtag force of farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants. They were poorly paid, poorly fed, and often lacked basic supplies like shoes and blankets. The early years of the war were brutal for the Americans. The British captured New York City and Philadelphia. Washington's army suffered a series of devastating defeats. The winter of 1777 at Valley Forge was a low point. Thousands of soldiers died from disease, starvation, and exposure. It seemed like the revolution was on the brink of collapse, but Washington held the army together through sheer force of will. And then came a turning point. On Christmas night in 1776, Washington led his troops on a daring crossing of the icy Delaware River to launch a surprise attack on Hessian mercenaries fighting for the British in Trenton, New Jersey. It was a stunning victory that boosted morale and showed that the Americans could win. Another crucial turning point came in 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. The American victory there was massive. It not only stopped a major British invasion from Canada, but, more importantly, it convinced France that the Americans had a real chance of winning. Benjamin Franklin, acting as the American ambassador in Paris, successfully negotiated an alliance. France, eager for revenge against Britain after the 7 Years' War, began sending money, supplies, and troops to help the American cause. The war dragged on for several more years, a brutal conflict that stretched from the northern forests to the southern swamps. But with French help, the tide slowly turned. The final act came in 1781 at Yorktown, Virginia. Washington, along with French forces, trapped the main British army under General Cornwallis. With the French Navy blocking any escape by sea, Cornwallis was forced to surrender. When news of the surrender at Yorktown reached London, the British Prime Minister reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over." He was right. The war was effectively over. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, formally recognizing the United States as an independent nation. 13 colonies of farmers, blacksmiths, and dreamers, with a piece of paper and a whole lot of courage, had stood up to an empire and created something entirely new. They gave birth to a nation founded on an idea, the radical idea that people could govern themselves. The story of the American Revolution is a testament to how ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they fight for what they believe in. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as inspiring as I do, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what part of this story surprised you the most. See you next time.